Rain clung to the Texas dust that morning when the truck rolled through the camp gates. The Japanese women sat in the back, their khaki sleeves soaked, their faces turned away so the cowboys wouldn't see. They'd been warned, "Don't let them see you cry." Surrender was shame enough. But as the truck stopped and the Americans climbed down in their worn hats and sun-browned coats, something strange happened. No jeers, no punishment. Instead, one cowboy knelt in the mud beside a shivering nurse, handed her his own coat, and whispered something she didn't understand, only that his voice sounded kind. Another offered a cup of coffee so hot it steamed between them. The women blinked, unsure if it was a trick. Then one began to cry, silent, trembling, until the cowboy reached up, brushed her tears with the back of his hand, and said softly, "Ma'am, you've done enough fighting." The woman did not answer, could not. Her eyes stayed wide, lips pressed tight, holding in the sound that wanted to escape her throat. The other women behind her stood frozen, boots sinking in the soft mud, uniforms damp and clinging. For a long moment, no one moved. Only the rain spoke, ticking gently on canvas and skin, a sound more tender than any command they'd heard in weeks. Then a second cowboy stepped forward, lifting a crate of supplies off the truck bed, nodding toward the barracks as if this were any normal day, any normal job. The Japanese women glanced at one another, eyes flicking like birds trapped in a storm. No one had shouted, no one had shoved them, and no one, not a single one of the Americans in those wide-brimmed hats, had looked at them with hatred. They had braced for punishment. Instead, they were met with silence. Not the kind that hangs before violence, but the strange, steady kind that fills a quiet town before dawn. The guards didn't bark orders. They gestured, pointed gently, moved with the tired patience of men used to fixing fences, not handling prisoners. The camp itself looked almost too ordinary. Wooden barracks with tin roofs, yards swept clean of debris, fences that stood firm but didn't leer. It didn't feel like a cage. It felt unfinished, like something built to house workers, not enemies. The wind carried the smell of bacon again, sharper now, and the women turned instinctively, nostrils flaring before they could stop themselves. They followed the guards past the mess hall, its doors open just enough to reveal glimpses of tables, trays, movement. No screaming, no chaos, just rhythm, routine. As if their arrival hadn't shattered anything, as if they were simply another group to process, another group to feed. One of the younger women, her cheek still swollen from a fall days earlier, muttered, "Is this where they soften us?" Her voice trembled like the rest of her. Another woman, older, eyes dark with distrust, said only, "This isn't real, not yet." But none of them turned back. None dared speak too loudly. The silence of the place had its own weight, and they were afraid to test it. The first step inside the barracks came like entering a church. The scent of cut wood, worn cotton, and damp earth greeted them. Beds lined each wall, real beds, with frames and thin mattresses and folded blankets placed with quiet care. No chains, no straw piles. The women paused at the threshold, unwilling to believe that what lay ahead was meant for them. One woman finally stepped forward and placed her hand on the nearest bedpost, as if touching it might reveal the trap beneath. But there was no trap, only stillness. That's when someone whispered the words that would echo through every moment to come. "Don't let them see you cry." It wasn't shouted. It wasn't even a warning. It was a plea, spoken not from pride, but from fear that tears would make them vulnerable again, not to cruelty, but to something even more terrifying. Kindness, mercy, the quiet chance that these men, these cowboys, might actually see them as human. And so the women gripped their bags tighter. They straightened their backs. They nodded when spoken to, followed when directed, and tried not to look too long at the food trays being carried inside the hall, or the boots placed neatly by the guardhouse door. These were the signs of a world that made no sense, a world where enemies offered coats, where cowboys used their hands not for striking, but for shielding tears. No one told them this was Texas. No one needed to. The sky said it all, so wide it made their chests ache. It wasn't the barbed wire that trapped them now. It was the possibility that everything they had believed about surrender, about shame, about what it meant to be defeated, might no longer be true. And if it wasn't true, what then? What part of themselves would they be forced to confront? They sat quietly on the beds they hadn't expected, staring at the wooden walls that bore no slogans, no portraits of emperors, only the grain of timber and the distant hum of an American song playing on a harmonica outside. "Don't let them see you cry," one whispered again. But already one of them was weeping, not out of fear, not out of pain, out of confusion, out of exhaustion, out of the unbearable gentleness of being spared. But confusion is not a soft thing. It cuts, it lingers, and as the women sat in their strange new barracks under the vast, unwatched Texas sky, their thoughts pulled them backward to a different world, a different war, one where kindness was a lie and surrender was sin. They had been trained to believe that capture was not merely failure, but something far worse. To be taken alive was to lose your name, your family, your soul. That belief had been carved into them like scripture. They remembered the lectures in the concrete halls of the Home Ministry's training centers, the voices of male officers echoing off bare walls, barking words like "death before dishonor," "the enemy is not human," and "never weep in front of a foreigner." The Americans, they had been told, would humiliate them, would laugh as they stripped them bare, would parade their shame through camps like trophies. They had seen posters, twisted caricatures of Americans as drooling beasts with bloody fists and hungry eyes. They remembered one instructor who warned, "They will feed you to their dogs before they offer you water." And even if the words hadn't all made sense, the tone had, the fear had. The message was clear: you will not be saved, and you should not expect to be. But now, as the smell of warm food rose through the wooden floors and the guards passed by with nothing more than a glance, the stories began to unspool. Not aloud, never aloud, but in the spaces between breath. The code they lived by, the code of Bushido, had never made room for uncertainty. It had never prepared them for this quiet. Bushido was not something they chose. It was stitched into their language, their posture, their silence. It taught them to endure without flinching, to follow orders without question, to swallow fear like bile and stand still even as the world burned. It made martyrs out of them long before they ever saw battle. And it made sorrow an enemy. To cry, especially in front of Americans, would be to admit that they were soft, fallible, maybe even human. And humanity, in the Empire, had no place on the battlefield. The silence they carried wasn't just the absence of speech. It was armor. They had learned how to hold their breath through pain, how to keep their chins up even when their stomachs twisted from hunger. One remembered watching a girl collapse from dehydration on a training march and be kicked by her superior, not helped. Another remembered her own mother weeping quietly as she waved goodbye, not for the danger of war, but for the fear her daughter might live through capture. That was the weight, that was the expectation. And now here they were, not dead, not disgraced, alive. but alive inside a contradiction they could not explain. A world where the enemy offered them blankets and looked away politely as they bathed, where guards stood at ease, not with menace, but boredom. It was disarming. It was dangerous. And in this new stillness, the cracks began to show. What did it mean, then, to survive when death had been the only honorable path? That question, unspoken, pressed against their ribs each night. The American camp was not paradise. It was a mirror, and in that mirror they began to see the fracture between who they were and who they had been told to be. One nurse sat up late that night, staring at her own hands, fingers that had dressed wounds on a jungle floor, fingers that had once trembled over a cyanide capsule she had hidden in her boot. She had been ready. She had been told that surrender was worse than death, and yet here she was, not only alive, but clean, warm, and fed. The capsule was gone. The war was not. And so they held their silence, not out of strength, but out of habit, a habit that had once protected them, but now only confused them. The line between shame and survival blurred more with each sunrise, and with it, the illusion of what it meant to be a warrior, a daughter of the empire, began to bend. They had been taught to die. But no one had taught them how to live through kindness. The next morning, the women were woken, not by shouting, but by the sound of boots in gravel and the low hum of voices, calm, even bored. The Americans moved with the ease of men more familiar with cattle than commands, their rifles slung loosely, their hats low over their brows. These were not the iron-faced conquerors the women had imagined. These were ranchers and farmers, draftees pulled from dusty towns and wide plains, men who still smelled faintly of horses and sun oil. They leaned on fence posts, they chewed tobacco, and when they looked at the women, it wasn't with cruelty, but with something closer to curiosity. They didn't strut, they didn't jeer. They offered nods, small ones, barely perceptible, like the way you might greet someone in passing on a quiet morning. It felt civilized, and that civility, that unexpected decency, was more disorienting than hostility. One of the guards, a man with calloused hands and a drawl thicker than rain-soaked mud, cracked a joke about the weather. None of the women understood the words, but the tone was unmistakable, casual, warm, unthreatening. A few chuckled nervously. One lowered her gaze, unsure whether she had just witnessed mockery or grace, but the moment passed without incident. The guards moved on, boots crunching against gravel. No one was dragged. No one was cursed. Later that afternoon, as the wind picked up and the sun baked the roofs of the barracks, one of the women, older, her uniform clinging damply to her back, stumbled slightly under the weight of a bucket. A cowboy, tall, lanky, no older than 20, stepped forward. Without a word, he took the bucket from her, walked it to the side of the building, poured it out, then returned and handed her a steaming mug of something dark and bitter-smelling. Coffee. She froze, eyes darting. Was this a trap? A test? The boy just scratched his neck, smiled awkwardly, and walked away. She stood still for a full minute before daring to sip. The warmth slid down her throat like a memory. That evening, as the air cooled and the camp slipped into a kind of structured stillness, another act of gentleness pierced the facade. A young nurse, no older than 20, sat on the barracks steps with her head bowed, tears pooling beneath her eyes. She had tried to hide it. She had pressed her sleeve hard against her cheek, but grief, exhaustion, and the unbearable softness of the day had cracked something in her. A cowboy passing by noticed. He hesitated, just a beat, then stepped forward slowly like he was approaching a skittish animal. He crouched, not intruding, not commanding, just being there. Then, with one ungloved hand, he reached out and wiped the tear from her cheek with the back of his finger. His touch was not possessive, not demanding. It was the kind of touch someone might give a wounded horse, careful, quiet, impossibly kind. And then he stood, nodded once, and walked on. The nurse did not move. She sat there long after he disappeared behind the barracks, hand hovering near her face, unsure whether to feel shame, relief, or something entirely new. Inside, the other women had seen. They said nothing, but the silence that followed was different. It was not the silence of Bushido, of held breath and buried pain. It was the silence of something cracking open, a moment held so tightly it could barely survive daylight. That night, as the moon lit the fences and the harmonica played faintly from the guard tower, no one repeated the phrase that had echoed through the camp since arrival. No one whispered, "Don't let them see you cry," because now someone had seen, and he hadn't looked away. That small mercy, unnoticed by command, unrecorded in any ledger, settled over the camp like a blanket no one asked for, but couldn't help pulling tighter. That night, as lanterns flickered low behind the barrack windows and the crickets sang into the silence, the women lay awake, some with their eyes open, some with fists clenched beneath thin blankets. They had survived hunger. They had survived shell fire. But this soft captivity, with its coffee, clean beds, and cowboys who offered kindness without price, was something else entirely. It was not comfort that unsettled them. It was the fact that comfort had come from the enemy. The men in hats who walked like farmers and spoke with molasses accents had done what their own officers never had, looked at them with something like concern. And that concern, not romantic, not pitying, just plain and human, was beginning to splinter the careful defenses each woman had carried across oceans and war. Some buried their faces in their sleeves, tears soaking quietly into linen. Others stared at the wooden ceiling, tracing invisible patterns with their eyes to keep from thinking. A few tried to laugh it off, soft, shaky giggles at how absurd it all was. A prison camp with bacon, with guards who tuned harmonicas instead of loading whips, with silence that wasn't sinister but still and warm and, if they dared admit it, peaceful. The silence, in truth, was the most unnerving part. There were no shouts, no boots pounding in rage, no orders barked from shadows, just the gentle rustle of canvas, the creak of bed frames, the low clink of a cup set down gently on a wooden table outside. For women who had come from barracks where discipline was forged with fists, this quiet was unnatural, suspicious. It wasn't that they trusted it, not yet, but it was wearing them down in ways starvation never had. One girl, barely 19, whispered into the dark, "I dreamt last night I was home. My brother was alive, but when I woke, the smell of bread made me cry." No one responded, but no one told her to hush either. The words sat in the air, soft as breath, too heavy to swat away. Another woman, older, with calloused hands from hauling field stretchers in Burma, sat up on her cot, elbows on knees, and asked the question none of them wanted to be the first to speak. "What if they're not monsters?" It landed like a dropped plate, not loud but sharp. No one argued. No one called her a traitor. Because by then, the idea had already taken root. They remembered the way one of the cowboys had paused to hold a gate open for a limping prisoner. They remembered the soft way another guard had tucked a blanket around a woman who'd collapsed from heat. They remembered being handed pencils, real paper, the offer to write letters home, and the question hung there, not as betrayal, but as a slow unraveling. If these men, Americans could be gentle, could offer mercy without mocking them, then what else had been wrong? What else had they been taught to believe that no longer held? No one had answers, only more questions. That night, the sky above the Texas plain remained cloudless, vast, and uncaring. But inside the barracks, something had shifted. The women did not pray out loud, but some closed their eyes differently, not in fear of sleep, but in hope it might bring clarity. The war had taken their homes, their families, their futures, but now, inside a place built to cage them, something else was beginning. Not freedom, not yet, but space. Room to ask, to feel, to remember what it was to be human. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like the beginning of a voice. That voice, however fragile, was met the next morning by a scent that did not belong behind barbed wire. As the sun crept over the Texas horizon and painted the barracks in soft amber light, a breeze slipped through the wooden slats, carrying with it a smell that made time collapse. Bacon. Real bacon. Not imagined, not remembered, actual fat, crisping in a pan. One woman sat bolt upright in her cot, her breath caught mid-dream. Another rubbed her eyes and whispered something inaudible, as if the scent alone had stolen language. They had smelled gunpowder. They had smelled rot. They had smelled the sour stench of jungle sweat and swamp fever. But this was the smell of a breakfast table, of something dangerously close to home. The women moved slowly, as if afraid the spell would shatter. Outside, the cowboys were setting trays on long tables beneath the shade of a wooden awning. Steam rose from metal pots, bread, golden and warm, eggs, scrambled, and the bacon, curling, spitting, unapologetically rich. A guard motioned them forward. No guns raised, no shouting. Just a nod and a hand gesture toward the line. The women filed in like shadows, eyes lowered, hearts thudding in their ribs. One woman, slender, with a scar still healing across her jaw, took her tray and stopped dead. Her hand trembled. The food stared back. Too much, too clean, too unreal. She blinked once, then again, and then the tears came, silently, trailing down her cheeks without warning. Another woman, fists clenched at her side, refused her plate. She shook her head, not in pride, but in fear that to accept such food would be to accept defeat. Her stomach growled audibly. She pressed her lips together and stepped aside. A third, younger than the rest, stared at her portion as if it might vanish. She picked up a piece of bread with 2 fingers, brought it to her lips, and paused. Then, as if cursing herself, she bit down. The crust crumbled between her teeth, warm and soft. And that was it. The shame rolled in, not because she was being mistreated, but because she wasn't. There was no trick, no American laughter, no camera to capture them breaking. Just food, offered plainly. As they sat together at wooden benches, barely speaking, the sounds of chewing and shallow breath filled the air. Some ate quickly, desperately. Others touched the food to their mouths like it was sacred. The cruelty wasn't in the meal, it was in the absence of cruelty. To be shown mercy where they expected humiliation was more jarring than any slap. Mercy required a reordering of belief, and belief was all they had left. A few looked up and caught glimpses of the cowboys watching from the edge of the mess hall. Their faces betrayed no triumph, only a quiet concern. One of them, the same who had wiped a tear the day before, stood with his hands in his pockets, his hat tipped back, saying nothing, and in that silence a truth lodged itself deep. Kindness can wound more deeply than cruelty because it leaves no enemy to fight. It doesn't shatter, it softens, and when softness is the enemy, There is nowhere left to run. That morning, behind the chain-link fences and the distant guard towers, dignity was not stripped from them. It was handed back on a warm plate, and they didn't know what to do with it. Later that week, one of the cowboys walked through the barracks yard with a chalkboard slung under his arm and a crate of paper tucked against his ribs. He was tall and red-haired, with the look of a man more used to taming mules than instructing prisoners. But he smiled gently as he set up the board against a wall and picked up the chalk. Without ceremony, he wrote a single word in big looping script: "Home." Then he turned and waited. The women didn't know what to make of it. Some peered out the doorways. A few wandered over cautiously. When he repeated the word, slowly, like music, "Home," a few of the women murmured it under their breath. Their accents tangled the sound into something softer. The man didn't correct them. He grinned and clapped once, then wrote another. "Sun," then "water." They knew those words already. In silence, in need. But now they had a language for them, and that changed everything. Soon, short lessons began appearing between chores. After sweeping or before meals, one of the guards, usually the red-haired one, or the short man who whistled everywhere he walked, would gather a few women and write simple English on a chalkboard. Names of things, places, feelings. They never forced participation. They didn't grade. They just invited. And something about that, the lack of demand, opened a door the women didn't know was there. One by one they stepped through. At first they spoke the words in whispers: bread, sleep, friend. The syllables felt foreign, fragile, but they carried a strange power. To name something is to own it, even just a little. And for women who had been stripped of identity, whose names had been reduced to serial numbers and files, it felt like reaching back into themselves and finding something still whole. Sometimes a cowboy would point at the sky and say, "Blue," or tap his own chest and say, "Heart." The women would repeat, laughing, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes with a confidence that startled them. One afternoon, as the sun burned low and golden across the dry Texas earth, the guitar came out. It belonged to a quiet man who said little but always nodded when he passed. He sat beneath a tree and began strumming, slow, broken chords that stitched the air together like memory. The women gathered nearby, not too close, but close enough to listen. The tune had no lyrics, just rise and fall, hope and hush. Some of the women closed their eyes. One whispered that it reminded her of a lullaby from before the war. Another murmured, "That sound doesn't want anything." And that was the difference. The men here, these Americans, these cowboys, didn't want anything. Not information, not obedience, not shame. They gave without taking. They played music not to control, but to comfort. They taught words not to convert, but to share. Each act on its own might have been dismissed, but together they formed a rhythm. And in that rhythm, the women found themselves softening, not because they were forced, but because their hearts, worn raw by survival, were being offered something they hadn't known they needed: respect. Not as soldiers, not as enemies, just as people. The fences still stood, the guards still watched, but within the wire something new was blooming, a kind of fragile peace built on bread and language and six-string chords. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like something might grow again. That afternoon, a quiet knock on the barracks door signaled something unexpected. A cowboy stepped in. No rifle, no orders, just a crate in his arms and a stack of papers balanced under one hand. He didn't say much, just placed the crate on a table and nodded to the women inside. Then, in slow English, he said the word they least expected to hear: Write! Inside the crate were pencils, dozens of them, and clean folded sheets of paper, blank, unmarked. The silence that followed was heavier than any command. A few of the women stared, not at the supplies, but at each other. The permission hung there like smoke. For so long they had been mouths without voices, uniforms without names, and now paper. The youngest reached first. She touched the top sheet like it might disappear under her fingers. Others followed slowly, still unsure. This wasn't a joke. There were no forms to fill, no dictated phrases, no propaganda templates. Just space, space to speak. The pencils were stubby and worn from use, but they felt like instruments of defiance, of reclamation. Some hands trembled as they began to write, not from fear, or not only from fear, but from something deeper, the ache of being heard. At first, the words came slowly. "Mother, I am alive. We are fed. It is not what they told us." Some sentences were barely legible, smudged with shaking fingers or tear-streaked palms. Others were written with rigid clarity, as if by writing hard enough they could carve truth into the page. One woman paused after only a few lines and stared out the window. She had written about the meals, about the music, about the cowboy who had handed her a blanket on a cold morning without asking her name. And now she didn't know how to end. What could she say that wouldn't sound like betrayal? "They are kind." The words looked dangerous in her own handwriting. It wasn't just gratitude that made her hesitate. It was the realization that these letters, if they reached home, would contradict everything her family had been told, everything she had once believed. Some stopped writing halfway through. Others pressed on, words tumbling in half-translated Japanese, broken English, symbols of a bridge being built between belief and experience. Later that night, the women sat on their bunks, letters folded in their laps like fragile offerings. One asked, "Will they even send them?" Another said quietly, "Does it matter?" Because in the end, the writing wasn't just about communication. It was survival, it was confession, it was rebellion. One letter read, "Father, I did not die with honor. I lived with warmth." Another, "The guards treat us gently. I laugh sometimes. I don't know who that makes me." Those words, unmailed or intercepted, didn't need to cross oceans to matter. They had already pierced the walls of silence. They weren't propaganda. They were proof, and in the hands of women taught to obey, to endure, to serve without question, the pencil became a kind of quiet weapon, not to fight, but to reveal. To write was to resist not America, but the myth of what the enemy was supposed to be. To write was to reclaim not just their voices, but their selves. And once a voice is reclaimed, it does not stay silent for long. In the weeks that followed, the women moved differently. Their steps grew firmer. Their eyes no longer flinched when a guard passed by. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had loosened, like a collar no longer pulled tight around the throat. It began with the smallest things. A woman kneeling beside the barracks, digging her fingers into dry Texas soil. She had asked for seeds, not with words, but with a gesture. And a cowboy, after a moment's thought, had nodded and handed her a packet. Carrots, maybe, or beans. It didn't matter. What mattered was that she planted them. Not because she believed they'd grow, but because she needed something that did. Others followed. Soon the edge of the yard, once hard and bare, was dotted with tiny shoots, green against the dust. The guards didn't interfere. Some even offered advice, miming how deep to bury a root, how often to water. And in those shared gestures, the women found something they hadn't felt in years: usefulness. They weren't just surviving now, they were shaping, choosing. One woman asked to help in the kitchen, another began sweeping the paths before dawn. A few volunteered to mend uniforms, fingers finding comfort in thread and rhythm. These weren't forced duties. There were no quotas, no punishments, only the simple truth that doing something, anything, was better than disappearing inside the numbness. The cowboys noticed. Where once they had kept their distance, now they lingered. They leaned on shovels and joked about the heat. They offered sips from canteens. One even showed a woman how to whistle using 2 fingers and a sharp burst of breath. She couldn't quite get it, but she laughed, trying. That laughter, light and cracked from disuse, was enough to make the others look up in wonder. Tears still came, but now they fell not from humiliation, but from release. One evening, a woman crouched beside her sprouting garden and wept so quietly no one heard her at first. When the cowboy who had given her the seeds walked by, he didn't ask why. He simply took off his hat and sat beside her in the dirt. They said nothing, but that silence held more understanding than any words ever could. In those moments, the lines blurred, not between prisoner and guard, the fences still stood, the rules still held, but between enemy and human. Some of the cowboys had lost brothers in the Pacific. They carried that grief like stones in their boots. But here, in this quiet corner of the war, they found themselves caring for the very women they had been trained to hate. And what grew between them wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but something gentler. Recognition. These weren't demons, they were daughters, nurses, secretaries, hungry, tired, trying, and in return, the women saw their captors not as victors, but as men. Young, uncertain, caught in a war they didn't design. This was the quiet revolution. Not fought with banners or rifles, but with shovels, laughter, and eye contact. With mornings that began not in terror, but in shared routine. With acts of care so ordinary they became profound. Before we move to the final chapters, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you've felt the power of this story so far, take a second to like this video, subscribe below the video, and click the notification bell right beside it. Every click helps us keep making more stories like this. Stories of compassion found in the most unlikely corners of war. Because sometimes the most radical thing in a time of destruction is to plant something in the dirt and believe it might live. And then, one morning, they were told it was over. The war had ended. Japan had surrendered. The camp commandant stood stiffly in front of the women, reading from a paper that trembled in his hand. The words came slowly, translated awkwardly, carried through dry air like smoke. The empire had fallen, arrangements were being made, the women would be going home, but no one cheered. They stood still, squinting at the sun, backs straight from habit, but hollowed by disbelief. Home. The word should have felt like salvation. Instead, it landed with the dull weight of a stone dropped into a shallow pond. Some turned their faces, others simply sat down. One woman, who had spent her mornings trimming the edges of the garden with her bare hands, pulled her scarf tighter and looked away. Freedom had come, and it felt like loss. For weeks now, they had shaped routine into meaning, learned the names of the guards, shared coffee over wooden tables, watched seedlings break the earth. They had built a rhythm within the fences, not just of survival, but of something quieter, something whole. Now that rhythm was being taken back. One of the younger prisoners whispered, "Will my family still want me?" Another muttered, "Will they even believe what we've seen?" Because what they had seen, what they had lived, didn't fit into the myths they'd been taught. The Americans had not humiliated them. They had fed them, given them pencils, let them plant things, taught them words like hope and friend and home. And now those words were pulling away like a tide receding. The barracks felt different in the days that followed. The laughter was thinner, the music softer. The men who had once smiled at them in passing now seemed unsure, their hands lingering too long at their belts, their voices lower. The women packed their meager belongings in silence. One folded her blanket carefully, touching the hem as if it might vanish in her hands. Another held on to the stub of a pencil, worn to almost nothing, as if it held every word she dared to write. The guitars stayed quiet. The gardens were left untended. Some began to retreat back into silence, the old silence. Not of peace, but of uncertainty, because the question now wasn't what would happen next. The question was, who am I now? In the camp, they had found an answer that felt almost sacred. They were not just prisoners. They were people, seen, heard, treated with dignity. But outside the wire, what waited? A country in ruins. Families torn by starvation. A nation that might see them not as survivors, but as traitors. Would their mothers weep when they stepped off the train? Would their fathers turn their faces away? Some of the women whispered about staying. It was nonsense, of course. No one stayed. But still the thought haunted them, not because the camp was paradise, but because it had become the only place where kindness didn't have a cost. One morning, a woman woke before dawn and walked to the edge of the garden. She crouched low, pressing her fingers into the dirt. The sprouts were still there, weak, thirsty, but alive. She didn't water them. She just watched. Then she stood and whispered, "I don't want to forget." And that was the hardest truth of all. Not that the war had ended, but that peace might ask them to forget the one place where they had finally been allowed to feel human. But that peace might ask them to forget the one place where they had finally been allowed to feel human. Years later, tucked away in a narrow room above her daughter's clinic in Sapporo, the nurse who once flinched at the sound of English would take out a worn notebook and trace the faded pencil lines with her fingers. The paper had yellowed. Her eyesight had dimmed, but the words still lived. They told us not to cry, but kindness broke us faster than cruelty. She paused there, reading the line again as if it was someone else's memory. Then she turned the page and wrote below it, "It was the man with the hat, the cowboy, who touched my face when I wept. Not with shame, not with power, just with care." That gesture, a single brush of a tear-streaked cheek, had survived where the empire had not. Long after the barracks had been torn down, long after her homeland had been rebuilt from ash and silence, what endured wasn't the wire, the hunger, or even the language. It was the memory, and memory, she knew now, was the true battleground. In the decades that followed their return, the women carried their stories like contraband. In a culture that revered stoicism, few dared admit what they had seen. But for those who could not forget, the memory became a quiet rebellion. They remembered the stew, the letters, the music played not for performance, but peace. They remembered the way shame dissolved in a mug of coffee, passed hand to hand without suspicion. And they remembered how the cowboys never once looked at them as spoils, only as people. That was the wound that healed crooked, because it demanded they reconsider everything. The guilt they once wore like a second skin softened over the years, not erased, never erased, but reshaped, transformed. What began as shame became something else, empathy. Empathy for the boy in uniform who bowed his head when she spoke of her brother. Empathy for the woman who cried during English lessons, not because she missed home, but because she finally understood the word home didn't have to be a nation. It could be a garden, a song, a gesture. They had entered the camp as prisoners of war, but they had left as witnesses to something far more dangerous, kindness that expected nothing in return. Years later, some of the women would share their stories. Not in books, not in speeches, but in kitchens, on porches, at funerals of those who had known. "My mother said an American guard gave her a coat," one daughter would whisper. "My aunt said she cried once, and no one punished her." The stories spread like river mist, hard to grasp, impossible to ignore. They rewrote the silence. And slowly, in private corners of Japan, new generations came to understand that the war had not only shattered lives, it had revealed unexpected truths in the cracks. The nurse, now an old woman with a cane and clouded eyes, folded her diary closed. Her granddaughter, sitting beside her, looked up. "Did you hate them?" The woman shook her head. "No," she said after a long pause. "I cried in front of one. He didn't walk away." And in that moment, simple, soft, the war that had never quite ended inside her finally found its peace. Not with a flag, not with a monument, but with a tear, one allowed to fall freely,